Why was it that the quiet ones were always dismissed first? On a base where voices were meant to carry, where commands were barked like weapons, silence was treated as weakness. At Fort, toughness was a currency, and silence, they thought, meant you had none to spend. But silence has layers. Sometimes it hides fear. Other times it masks calculation. And in the case of Lena Park, silence was something else entirely. It was both shield and blade. The base didn't see it when she arrived. They weren't meant to. Fort was a machine of order, built on sweat, repetition, and a pride that ran deeper than the steel fences that surrounded it. More than 300 active-duty soldiers moved about its grounds like gears in an engine, synchronized, disciplined, obedient. Above them all stood Colonel James. To most, he wasn't just a man, he was law embodied. His word was tradition. His voice could stop a grown man, and to him, Lena Park was nothing more than a mistake, a disruption ordered down from command. She stepped out of a black SUV one gray Monday morning, the mist still clinging to the training yards. Small frame, plain clothes, no rank on her shoulders, no insignia to announce her authority. A duffel bag hung loosely at her side. There was no smile, no mask, no effort to soften her presence. Just calm eyes scanning the compound as if measuring it piece by piece. Some soldiers muttered, others smirked. That's the new instructor. One whispered, probably some consultant, a safety officer. A lecture and gone in a week. They spoke with certainty because that's what the base had taught them, that strength was visible, that authority came with volume. And Lena showed neither. Colonel stood waiting, arms folded, boots planted, a scowl carved into his face. He had argued against her arrival. He had told command in words sharp enough to draw blood that combat training was no place for civilians, especially not quiet, untested women. But command overruled him, and orders were orders even for him. "You're Lena Park," he barked when she approached. She stopped, duffel bag still at her side, clipboard in hand. Her voice, when it came, was soft, controlled. "Yes, sir." "You're not military." His tone wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "No, sir." "What gives you the right to train my men?" "I've been authorized." She held up the paperwork. "That's not what I asked," he snapped. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She simply met his eyes, not with defiance, not with submission, but with the kind of stillness that unsettles a man who thrives on being in control. Like water, capable of reflecting sunlight or of pulling you under without warning. Finally turned his head sharply. "You're assigned to the southern drill yard. Don't get in the way." And that was her welcome. By noon, the entire base knew her name. Some laughed about her size. Others shook their heads at the thought of taking orders from someone so quiet. More than one soldier muttered under his breath, "She won't last the week." And through it all, Lena Park walked silently, eyes observant, posture flawless, every step precise. That first day she didn't command, she didn't demonstrate, she simply watched. A notepad in hand, she studied the drills, who moved stiffly, who hesitated, who masked nerves with arrogance. She didn't interfere, she didn't explain herself. She just watched. And if you were looking closely enough, you would have seen it, the way her gaze lingered a second too long on a soldier's stance, the way she marked rhythm in her breathing, as if memorizing each flaw, each strength, each hesitation. But no one was looking closely, not yet. The first test came sooner than expected. It was Wednesday morning. The mist hadn't yet lifted when Private Jard Booth spotted her walking back from the equipment shed. He was stocky, young, full of the kind of reckless confidence that often gets men hurt, and he didn't like being told there was something new he had to respect. "Hey, civilian," he called out, his voice carrying just enough for a few nearby recruits to hear. "You really think you can teach us anything? You ever even been shot at?" She stopped, turned. "Yes," she said. And she kept walking. Booth let out a laugh. "Yeah, did you cry or did you shoot back?" She stopped again, slowly. Her voice was steady when she replied, "I don't cry in combat, it clouds judgment." And then she moved on. Booth didn't laugh again, not that day. But soldiers are like wolves. They circle what they think is weak. They press, prod, test. To them, Lena Park's quiet was weakness waiting to be exposed. They didn't understand that her silence wasn't fear. It was strategy. Thursday, the colonel reluctantly approved her first demonstration. 10 recruits, 10 minutes. He expected her to stumble, to embarrass herself, to prove him right. The soldiers gathered, arms crossed, ready for a lecture. What they got instead was movement. She didn't waste time with words. She simply stepped onto the mat and began. Footwork so fluid it looked rehearsed. Timing so sharp it seemed rehearsed 1,000 times over. She moved like wind, redirecting force with small, precise motions. One recruit, eager to prove himself, went at her with full strength. In a blur of leverage and calm calculation, Lena flipped him onto the mat. A clean takedown. No struggle, no flourish. The soldiers froze. Even Sergeant, hardened and skeptical, found his eyes narrowing, his breath catching. That night curiosity gnawed at him. He searched her name, pulling threads through restricted databases until something surfaced. Most of it was blacked out, redacted, but enough remained. Sentinel Group 7. A unit so deep in the shadows most had only heard whispers. Infiltration, psychological warfare, close quarters elimination. The kind of training designed for ghosts, not people, and Lena Park had been one of them. Leaned back in his chair, pulse quickening. She shouldn't be here, she's overqualified. By Friday, the whispers had shifted. Not everyone laughed anymore. Some watched, some wondered, and the colonel noticed. He noticed the way eyes followed her, the way silence in her presence wasn't dismissal anymore, it was weight. He hated it. He tried to press harder, trash duty, menial tasks, public scolding, anything to force her hand. And still she accepted each order without complaint. She swept floors, sorted logs, cleaned equipment with the same quiet efficiency she brought to the mat. Unsettled, approached her one evening. "You gonna let him keep walking over you like that?" She didn't look up. He's trying to draw a reaction. If I give it to him now, he controls the outcome. Feels like he already does. "No," she said softly, "he only thinks he does." Walked away, her words echoing louder than any shout he'd heard on that base. And somewhere deep down, even before the storm came, he realized Colonel James wasn't fighting her. He was feeding her. Because storms don't arrive announced. They build quietly, and when they finally break, there is no stopping them. Why was it that no one could stop watching her? She didn't raise her voice. She didn't bark orders. She barely spoke at all. And yet by Thursday evening, whispers of Lena Park's first demonstration had already moved through every hallway, every barrack, every mess hall. Soldiers who hadn't even been there repeated second-hand descriptions as if they'd seen it themselves. She dropped him like nothing. Didn't even breathe hard. She didn't even look angry. They said these things quietly, as if saying them too loud might break the spell. Colonel James heard them too. He didn't acknowledge it, of course. He pretended not to care. But behind his eyes, a fire was growing. He had built his reputation on dominance, on breaking down recruits, on reminding every man under his command that fear was the foundation of discipline. But Lena Park's calm was unraveling something he couldn't quite name. And the worst part, she hadn't done much of anything at all. Friday morning, she was assigned trash duty. The order came directly from. He wanted to grind her down, bury her beneath humiliation. A civilian woman sweeping the gym floors, sorting logs, cleaning sparring dummies. It was theater for him, proof to his soldiers that her place was beneath them. But Lena accepted it without hesitation. She swept in silence. She sorted logs with precision. She repaired sparring equipment with the same care she gave her movements on the mat. Soldiers watched from a distance, confused. If she was supposed to be a combat instructor, why wasn't she pushing back? Why wasn't she resisting? That evening, Sergeant Caleb approached her outside the office. He had seen enough to know there was more to her story, but the patience in her face unnerved him. "You gonna let him keep walking over you like that?" he asked quietly. Lena didn't look up from the stack of training reports she was organizing. "He's trying to draw a reaction," she said. "If I give it to him now, he controls the outcome." Frowned, "Feels like he already does." Her reply was calm, certain. "No, he only thinks he does." He stepped back, unsettled. And though he didn't admit it then, that answer stuck with him for the rest of the night. Saturday morning brought another shift. During a training drill, a group of soldiers deliberately ignored her instructions. They mimicked her movements with exaggerated clumsiness, laughed under their breath, and exchanged smug glances when she stopped mid-session. Without a word, she put down her notepad and walked away. From across the field, Colonel grinned. He leaned toward a junior officer beside him. "Looks like she knows her place now," he muttered. But had seen something different. He had seen her eyes before she walked away, not defeated, not embarrassed, calculating. He realized with a sinking feeling that she wasn't retreating, she was studying. 2 days later, she called out those same mocking soldiers one by one during a precision drill. What followed was nothing flashy, nothing theatrical. She invited each man to spar with her, smiling, confident, still convinced she was a fraud. And one by one, she dismantled them. No taunts, no humiliation, just clean, efficient technique. A wrist redirected here, a shoulder dropped there. A movement that ended before the soldier even realized it had begun. Each man walked away breathless, red-faced, humbled. By the third soldier, whispers rippled across the yard. "Who is she? She's not just some consultant. Colonel must be losing it." Refused to admit it. Instead, he doubled down. He reassigned her to equipment maintenance, officially calling it rotation, though everyone knew it was punishment. And once again, Lena without complaint. She cleaned, she repaired, she stayed late polishing mats and dummies. But something was happening, slowly, quietly. Soldiers began showing up after hours. They came with questions, with curiosity they couldn't suppress anymore. She didn't lecture them. She didn't boast. She simply demonstrated a shift of balance, a correction in posture, a way of breathing that made their movements sharper, cleaner. And though she never spoke of her past, though she never named her credentials, every movement carried a weight words couldn't touch. By the end of the week, noticed something unsettling. Morale was improving. The same recruits who laughed at her days earlier now adjusted their stances without being told. Discipline was tightening. Cohesion was forming. And it wasn't because of the colonel's bark. It was because of her silence. Noticed too, and it terrified him. Friday evening, Lena was standing in the training yard with 15 soldiers, quietly demonstrating pressure points on a practice dummy. Leaned against a post in the shadows, watching. Then the colonel walked in. "You're not authorized to teach unscheduled sessions," barked, his voice echoing across the yard. Lena turned calmly. "They asked me to." "I didn't," he snapped. She nodded, understood. "Pack it up," he ordered, "now." The soldiers hesitated, their eyes shifting between him and her. For the first time, hesitation cracked their obedience. Without another word, Lena picked up her bag, bowed slightly to the group, and walked away. Turned to the men. "This is a military base, not a dojo. If you want real training, you come to me." But the tone had changed. He saw it in their posture, their eyes, their silence. And for the first time in years, Colonel James felt his grip on Fort slipping. That night in his office, he stared at the wall in silence. She wasn't fighting him. She wasn't challenging his authority with defiance. That would have been easier. He could have crushed that. Instead, she was outclassing him. Quietly, calmly, without raising her voice. She was winning hearts and minds by simply existing in contrast to his fury. And he couldn't stand it. So he made a decision. "Public drill," he muttered. His voice shook with rage, but the idea steadied him. Hand-to-hand, me versus her. No gear, no padding, a combat demonstration. It wasn't just a challenge, it was a trap. If she refused, she would look weak. If she accepted, he would humiliate her in front of the entire base. Signed the request and made it official. The next morning the bulletin went up. Live combat drill. Colonel versus civilian instructor Park. Attendance mandatory. 1600 hours. Parade yard. The base buzzed. Unprecedented, soldiers muttered. Insane, others whispered. Will she accept? She has to, said grimly. This isn't a challenge, it's a public execution. But Lena didn't hesitate. She showed up at 1600 hours sharp. No excuses, no fear, just silence. And by the end of that day, silence would speak louder than any voice in Fort's history. The buildup was electric. Word spread beyond. Officers whispered about it in command meetings. Recruits skipped lunch to get better views. Even the kitchen staff found excuses to slip outside. By 1555 hours, 324 soldiers stood in perfect rows on the parade ground. Phones were discreetly raised. The air itself felt heavy, as if the base was holding its breath. Colonel stripped off his shirt, his muscles flexed, his posture proud. Lena Park stood barefoot in a gray training outfit, hair tied back, no expression on her face. Raised his voice. Today is a demonstration, a reminder that tradition, strength, and discipline still matter. Lena bowed. The crowd murmured. She bowed to him, she's not even scared. Crossed his arms in the front row, his jaw clenched. He had seen war, he had seen fear, but this wasn't fear, this was something else. The whistle blew. And the storm began. Why was the air so heavy that afternoon? Soldiers later swore they could feel it in their lungs, a pressure, as if the parade ground itself knew something irreversible was about to happen. 324 men and women stood in rows, their boots planted, their eyes forward, yet not a soul could look away from the mat in the center of the yard. Colonel James paced like a wolf, his chest heaving, his muscles flexed in the sun. Shirtless, jaw clenched, veins bulging in his arms, he wanted every man there to see him, to remember his body, his strength, his dominance. This was supposed to be his stage. Lena Park stood across from him, barefoot in a simple gray training outfit. No padding, no gloves, no armor. Her posture was straight, her breathing steady. She didn't posture, didn't flex, didn't feed the crowd, she simply bowed. And the bow changed everything. Whispers rippled through the formation. She bowed to him, she's not even scared. The whistle blew. The colonel advanced. His boots slammed against the mat like drumbeats. He swung first, fast and loud, a heavy jab meant to crush her jaw. It cut through the air like a hammer. Lena tilted her head, just slightly. The punch missed her cheek by less than an inch. Gasps rose from the crowd. Stumbled forward, caught off balance by the emptiness where her body should have been. He growled and swung again, this time with a hammer fist aimed at her collarbone. Lena ducked, rolled under, rose back up, her hands still at her sides. She didn't even look winded. "Fight me," shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "What are you scared of?" Still, she didn't answer. The silence unnerved him more than any insult could have. He roared again, sweeping his leg in a wide arc. She jumped lightly, landed softly, almost weightless. Every movement flowed, precise, economical, measured. Soldiers leaned forward, unsure what they were witnessing. This wasn't defense. It wasn't even counterattack. "She's dancing with him," a private whispered. "No," muttered, "she's reading him." It was true. Every strike he threw was too loud, too wide, too desperate. And every dodge she made was too clean, too controlled. She wasn't resisting his power. She was letting it break itself against her calm. Couldn't see it, rage clouded him. To him she wasn't silent, she was mocking him. He lunged again, this time feinting left before lunging right, trying to grab her waist and drag her down. Lena pivoted, spun past his grasp and slid behind him. For a split second her hand touched his shoulder, just enough to let him know, "You're off balance." He staggered. The crowd whispered louder. "You think this is a game?" Spat, red-faced, sweat dripping down his temples. Still no answer. The silence was unbearable. He roared again and charged full force. It was his worst mistake. Lena pivoted, caught his wrist mid-lunge, and with a single twist redirected his own weight. In one smooth, surgical motion, she forced him to one knee, his arm locked in her grip. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold. She could have finished it right there. But she let go. Scrambled back up, humiliated, his chest heaving. Not a single strike landed, not one. The crowd wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't mocking. They were silent, reverent, as if watching something they weren't supposed to see. And then it happened. The moment that would be replayed in whispers, in phone recordings, in the collective memory of Fort for years to come. Charged again, desperation in his eyes, fury driving his fists. He swung hard, aiming for her temple, a blow that could have killed if it connected. Lena didn't step aside. She didn't retreat. This time she moved through him. Her left hand caught his elbow. Her right hand slid under his wrist. In a single, flawless pivot, she turned her hips, redirected his momentum, and brought him crashing down, face first, hard. And then she finished it. Her grip shifted, a twist, a snap. The sound echoed across the parade ground like a rifle crack. A bone breaking. His scream followed a second later, guttural, animal, the kind of sound that cuts through the spine. He rolled onto his back, clutching his arm, bent in a direction arms were never meant to bend. His face contorted, pale, his pride shattered alongside the bone. The yard fell silent. 324 soldiers, frozen in formation, watching. Not one cheered, not one clapped, not one moved. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't spectacle, it was something else. Judgment. Lena Park stood over him, breathing steady, her face calm. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile, she didn't speak. She simply stepped back, bowed once, and walked away. No victory cry, no demand for recognition. Just finality. His chest was pounding. He had seen combat, chaos, the violence of war. But this was something different. This wasn't a fight. It was a dismantling. It was surgical, controlled, silent. He turned to the soldier beside him and whispered. He just dug his own grave. She buried him in it. Medics rushed in, trying not to meet her eyes as they lifted the colonel onto a stretcher. His screams still echoed in their ears. By the time the helicopter lifted him out, sedated and broken, he no longer looked like a man. He looked small, fragile, forgotten. And Lena, she didn't look back. She walked through the parted rows of soldiers, each one instinctively stepping aside, not out of fear, but reverence. Their silence followed her all the way off the parade ground. Something had shifted. The woman who had swept floors days earlier was no longer invisible. She was legend. That night was called into command. Officers sat around a long table, their faces a mix of shock, concern, and grudging awe. Major leaned forward. "Sergeant, you've been close to Miss Park. What's your professional opinion?" Hesitated. He pictured the colonel grabbing her wrist, barking insults, shoving her into the dirt. He pictured her silence, her restraint, the way she could have destroyed him completely but chose not to. She didn't escalate, said quietly. She finished it. An older officer grunted. She snapped the colonel's arm. His eyes were steady. He went at her with intent. She could have broken more than his arm. She chose not to. The room fell silent. No one could argue. Dozens of phones had captured it. None showed Lena striking first. All showed charging, swinging, lunging, consumed by pride. And all showed her ending it in less than 2 seconds. "She's not a threat," added, "unless someone tries to make her one." Back in the barracks, whispers filled the air. Soldiers huddled in groups, replaying the video frame by frame. "Did you see the way she caught his elbow? She pivoted before he even moved." She could shattered both arms, she didn't. They weren't exaggerating. The lesson wasn't in the break, it was in the restraint, the control, the silence. By sunrise, the question was, who is she? The question was, what else is she capable of? Lena sat cross-legged on her bunk that night, eyes closed, her breathing calm. She hadn't eaten, she hadn't spoken, she hadn't written a report, she didn't need to. Because the truth was simple. The colonel had threatened her. And she had answered. Not with words, but with silence sharp enough to break an arm. Why did silence linger longer than sound? The snap of the colonel's arm had echoed across the parade yard like a gunshot, but it was the silence that followed that haunted everyone afterward. 324 soldiers, frozen in place, had watched pride shatter in less than 2 seconds, and long after the colonel's scream faded into the distance, the silence still held them. The medevac helicopter carried him away before dusk, his body strapped down, his face pale, his arms splinted and elevated. Sedated, broken, smaller than anyone had ever seen him. And as the blades whirred above Fort, a truth settled over the soldiers below. Authority had shifted. No one spoke it aloud. They didn't have to. Lena Park had walked off the mat without a word, her steps precise, her expression unreadable. She hadn't gloated. She hadn't looked back. She hadn't demanded anything. And that was what unnerved them most. She had dismantled the most feared man on base as if tying her shoes, and then left as if it had never mattered. That night the videos spread, not officially, quietly, soldier to soldier, phone to phone. The clip was less than 10 seconds, but it became a legend before the sun even rose again. Frame by frame they dissected it, the tilt of her head, the pivot of her hips, the split-second calculation before the break. She didn't even blink. She timed it before he moved. She knew his attack before he did. For years, recruits had been told that strength was volume, power was dominance, authority was bark and bite. But Lena Park had rewritten the rule book without saying a word. And the question on everyone's lips was no longer, who is she? It was, what else is she capable of? In the command center, officers sat in heavy silence around a long table. Major broke it first, his voice tight. We've spoken with division command. Colonel's actions were deemed outside protocol. Instructor Park acted in self-defense during an agreed training demonstration. A captain shifted uneasily. Are there charges being filed? No, said. He clicked a remote and a still frame of the video appeared on the screen. Lena mid-pivot, mid-lunge. There won't be. In fact, he pressed again. A document appeared, stamped with command seal. Effective immediately, Lena Park is to be recognized as Senior Combat Tactics Instructor at Fort. All personnel are advised to comply with her directives without exception. The room was silent again, but for a different reason. They had no argument. She hadn't started the fight. She hadn't escalated it. She had ended it. And she had ended it with such clarity that even the highest brass couldn't deny it. She's not a threat, finally said into the silence, unless someone tries to make her one. Some nodded, others remained still. But all of them knew the truth. Fort would never be the same again. Back in the barracks, the shift was already happening. Recruits who once laughed at her now lowered their voices when she passed. Veterans who dismissed her now studied her movements in silence. Men who mocked her for sweeping floors now whispered respect. Some replayed the video over and over, not to marvel at the break, but to understand the restraint. She could have shattered both arms. She could crushed his throat. She didn't. She only did what was necessary. It was restraint that awed them. Restraint in a place where restraint was rarely taught. By Sunday morning, soldiers who once ignored her now stood when she walked by. Some offered sharp salutes. She nodded politely but said little. She didn't crave their admiration. She didn't need it. But she understood momentum. And momentum was shifting toward her. Found her before sunrise at the training grounds. She was stretching alone on the mat, the air still cool, the sky just beginning to glow. "You know everyone's looking at you different now," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "They're listening too." "I didn't ask for that." "No," said stepping closer, "but you earned it." She paused, then looked out across the empty yard. "Will they respect me," she asked softly, "or just fear what I can do?" Exhaled slowly. "They respect you because you didn't destroy him. You could have, but you didn't." Her eyes softened, but she didn't answer. Because she hadn't come to prove herself. She hadn't come to dominate, she had come to teach. And maybe, just maybe, now they were ready to learn. Monday morning, her first official session as senior instructor began at 500 sharp. She didn't advertise it. She didn't remind anyone. She simply stepped onto the mat and waited. 42 soldiers were already there. By the end of the week, the number had doubled. They came not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of respect. And Lena didn't start with flashy takedowns or counterattacks. She started with basics: breathing, posture, stance. At first, recruits grumbled. "This is yoga," one muttered. "She's wasting our time." But those who stayed longer noticed something shift. Their movements grew sharper, their reactions faster, their sparring more calculated. They started anticipating strikes rather than reacting to them. They started thinking. Lena never raised her voice. She never commanded the room. She held it with presence alone. And slowly, something profound began to happen. Ego began to disappear. For years, Fort had thrived on arrogance, the loudest bark, the hardest punch, the fastest takedown. But Lena dismantled that culture the same way she dismantled the Colonel, quietly, precisely, without needing to shout. She taught them to move with control instead of chaos, to use an opponent's strength against them, to read intention through breath, to strike with precision, not force. And slowly, the mat itself became sacred ground. One afternoon, Sergeant Graves, a bulldozer of a man who once mocked her openly, approached her after class. He was sweating, breathing hard, his pride softened by humility. "I've been training for 15 years, he admitted, voice low, "and I've never learned as much in a week as I have watching you." Lena nodded once. No smile, no false modesty, just a simple truth: growth starts when pride ends. 6 words. They spread across the base like a mantra. By the second week, the tone of the entire compound had shifted. Soldiers who once cut corners during drills now pushed themselves harder. Arguments that once broke out in training now dissolved into focus. Recruits who dragged their feet in the mornings now arrived early, waiting on the mat before dawn. Even the officers noticed. Reports showed fewer infractions, stronger cohesion, sharper performance. But not everyone embraced the change. Captain Withers, longtime second in command, watched with suspicion. He hadn't spoken to Lena directly since the fight, but in meetings his eyes lingered, sharp, measuring. He wasn't convinced. Not yet. And in Lena's silence, something deeper was happening. She didn't just break a man's arm, she had broken a cycle. At Fort, power had always been proven through dominance, through volume, through force. But Lena Park was teaching them that real power didn't shout. Real power whispered. And in that whisper, 324 soldiers began to find their strength. Why did people mistake restraint for weakness? It was the same mistake the Colonel had made, and now his arm was in a sling hundreds of miles away. But still, some clung to old beliefs, unable to accept that control could be stronger than rage. Among them was Captain Thomas Withers. He had been Colonel's right hand for years. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stare that had made recruits shrink, Withers embodied the old guard of Fort. He believed in bark and bite, in showing dominance first and asking questions later. And while others began to shift under Lena Park's influence, Withers remained a wall. He attended meetings in silence, his jaw locked, his arms folded, watching her every move. He saw how soldiers now trained harder under her quiet guidance than they ever had under shouted orders. He saw how recruits who once mocked her now lined up before dawn, eager for instruction. He saw how, a man Withers respected, spoke of her with something dangerously close to reverence. And he couldn't accept it. Not without seeing it for himself. It was a Tuesday morning when he finally stepped onto her mat. The air was already thick with sweat and discipline. Soldiers stood in neat circles, practicing breathing techniques Lena had drilled into them for days. No one spoke. Their silence mirrored hers, a rhythm that stretched across the room. "I want a demonstration," Withers said loudly, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. Heads turned, soldiers froze mid-stance. Lena looked up slowly. Her expression was calm, unreadable. "With who?" "With me," Withers said. His voice carried authority, full contact. The room buzzed with whispers. This wasn't part of the schedule. This wasn't a drill. This was a test. Lena studied him for a moment. Then, without argument, she nodded. The soldiers formed a circle around the mat. Some shifted uneasily. Some leaned forward, anticipation written on their faces. They had all seen what she had done to, but Withers wasn't. He wasn't sloppy with rage. He was measured, calculated. He knew how to fight. And he wasn't charging in blind. Withers stepped onto the mat, rolling his shoulders, cracking his knuckles. His posture was controlled, his breathing steady. He wanted to show the recruits what discipline looked like. He wanted to prove that Lena Park's silence wasn't enough to stand against a soldier trained for battle. He moved first, a jab quick, precise, aimed not to crush but to test. Lena shifted, a flick of her wrist, a pivot of her body. She didn't counter. She redirected, letting the punch pass by like water around stone. Withers came again, a low kick sharp meant to catch her stance. She stepped aside, redirected, reset. No counter, no retaliation. "Come on," he growled, teeth clenched. "I'm giving you openings." She met his eyes calmly. "You're showing me motion," she said softly, "not intention." The words hit him harder than any strike. For a split second he faltered, and in that hesitation Lena moved, not with force but with clarity. Withers lunged again, faster this time. A combination of elbow, punch, and spinning feint calculated to overwhelm, but Lena flowed around him like smoke. She slipped past his final blow, pivoted, and in one motion stepped behind him. One hand tapped his shoulder gently. The other brushed his hip. "You're off balance," she whispered. Withers froze. The recruit saw it instantly. She could have ended it. She hadn't. She chose not to. Withers stumbled just slightly, enough to feel the truth of her words, enough to know that if she had wanted to, he'd already be on the ground. Silence filled the room. No one clapped, no one cheered. They didn't need to. Withers bowed his head once, then stepped back. And from that day forward, he never questioned her again. The demonstration spread through the base like wildfire. Soldiers repeated it in whispers the way they once whispered about the colonel's broken arm. She didn't even strike him. She could have dropped him at any second. She just showed him and let him go. What had once been arrogance on the mat was now reverence. What had once been pride was now humility. And slowly, something profound began to happen. The culture of Fort shifted in ways no one could have predicted. Soldiers who once competed to dominate sparring sessions now focused on balance. Recruits who once scoffed at basic breathing drills now practiced them with religious devotion. Even hardened veterans began stepping onto the mat humbly, asking questions instead of barking commands. Discipline sharpened, arguments lessened, unity grew. Lena Park hadn't just snapped a man's arm. She had snapped an entire system into a new shape. Noticed it first. He watched from the sidelines as recruits sparred with more calculation, as soldiers corrected each other gently instead of mocking mistakes. He saw the way men who once ignored Lena now hung on her every word, waiting for a correction, a nod, even just a glance. "You've rebuilt this place," he told her one evening as they stood overlooking the empty training yard. Lena shook her head. "It was never broken, just stuck in the wrong pattern. Now it knows what right feels like." Studied her in silence, the weight of her words settling deep. "People think snapping's arm made you a legend," he said. "It didn't," Lena replied. Her voice was calm but unshakable. "What I did after that did." Weeks passed, the change deepened. By now, morning classes were full before dawn. Soldiers volunteered for weekend drills. PT infractions dropped to nearly zero. The base that once moved like a machine now moved like a living thing, focused, precise, cohesive. But Lena never changed. She didn't seek recognition. She didn't crave authority. She still walked silently, still bowed politely, still answered questions with patience and calm. And that was why they followed her. Not because she demanded it. Because she didn't have to. But change never comes without resistance. And somewhere beyond the gates of Fort, Colonel James nursed his broken arm and his shattered pride. He filed complaints. He sent letters. He called in favors. But command dismissed him quietly. His accusations were swallowed by Lena's record, partially unsealed, revealing just enough of her sentinel group past to silence his protests. He had underestimated her. And now he was a footnote. Lena Park had become the future. And still she remained the same. At night, alone in her quarters, she folded her clothes neatly, lined her boots by the door, and sat in silence. Her breathing was steady. Her eyes were tired, not from the fight, not from the weight of teaching, but from being seen. She had never wanted this, never wanted to be legend. But once the curtain was pulled back, there was no way to hide again. A knock came at her door. Stepped in, holding a folded paper, the memo announcing her official promotion. "You've gone from invisible to legendary in a week," he said, half smiling. "I didn't plan for this," Lena replied. "No one plans for history," said. "It just happens." He handed her the paper. She set it on the desk without reading it twice. "They'll expect things now," she said quietly. "They already do," replied. "But they're listening, Lena. You don't need to say much. When you move, they follow." She looked at him then, her eyes dark but calm. "Will they respect me," she asked, "or just fear what I can do?" Shook his head. "They respect you because you didn't destroy him. You only did what was necessary." And that was the difference. That was the lesson. Not to prove strength by breaking, but to prove it by restraint. Fort had been a place of bark and bite, of arrogance and fear. Now, under Lena Park's silence, it was becoming something else. And the soldiers who once laughed at her now carried a truth they couldn't unlearn. Sometimes strength doesn't shout. Sometimes it whispers. Why do the higher ranks always arrive when change has already taken root? Not to plant the seed, not to water it, but to measure its growth. At Fort, they had come to measure Lena Park. Rumors had traveled faster than official reports. Soldiers whispered. Videos circulated beyond the gates, reaching ears that weren't supposed to hear them. A civilian woman had dropped a colonel in front of his entire command. A civilian woman had turned arrogance into discipline. A civilian woman had taken a broken base and in weeks made it stronger. It was inevitable that someone higher up would come to see it for themselves. The man who arrived was General Vance. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with eyes like sharpened steel, he was known throughout the division as a man allergic to excuses. His presence alone carried weight. Soldiers straightened at the sight of him, their movements sharper, their voices quieter. He was the kind of leader who didn't need to bark to be obeyed. When he walked through the gates of Fort, every detail was noticed. His stride, his silence, his inspection of every corner of the base as if weighing it against some invisible standard. And when his gaze fell on the training yard, what he saw was not the base he remembered. At 500, the yard was alive with movement. Dozens of soldiers stood in perfect form, their breaths synchronized, their stances precise. They moved through drills with focus sharper than any he had seen in years. Not sloppy, not distracted, not half-hearted. There was discipline in their rhythm. He watched in silence, his hands behind his back, as Lena Park guided them. She didn't bark, she didn't correct loudly. She moved among them like a shadow, offering a nod here, a touch of correction there. Soldiers followed her gestures without hesitation. When she stepped, they mirrored. When she breathed, they aligned. General Vance's eyes narrowed. This was not coincidence. This was culture. And culture, he knew, was the hardest thing to change. Afterward, he requested a private meeting. She entered his office quietly, her posture straight, her eyes steady. No arrogance, no nervousness, just calm. "Ms. Park," he began, his voice low but commanding. "I've seen many instructors in my career. Few have changed a base the way you have." "Thank you, sir," she said softly. "But I want to know," he leaned forward, "what drives you?" Lena paused. For a moment silence filled the room. Then she spoke, her words precise, deliberate. "I wasn't here to prove anything to the military. I was here to prove something to the women who follow me. That strength isn't loud. That respect isn't demanded. That silence can be power." Vance studied her, the lines on his face deepening. "The base has improved in every measurable way," he said finally. "Fewer injuries, stronger cohesion, higher morale. What you've done here is a model for the entire division." She nodded politely, but her expression didn't change. No pride, no triumph, only quiet. Before she left, he slid a sealed envelope across the desk. "Consider this a formal offer," he said. "A position as Chief Combat Instructor at Division Headquarters." It was an honor, more than an honor. It was recognition on a scale few ever reached. But Lena didn't reach for the envelope. She folded her hands, her voice even. "I'll consider it, sir, but my first duty is here, with the soldiers who need me most." Outside was waiting. He grinned when he saw her. "So?" he asked. She handed him the envelope. He raised an eyebrow but didn't open it. "Change is coming," she said softly, "but it starts with a single step." Nodded, he'd seen it already. The change wasn't in reports or memos. It was in the way soldiers carried themselves. In the way they no longer smirked at new recruits but helped them. In the way they no longer competed to dominate but competed to grow. And all of it had started with a woman who had been invisible. That evening, Lena stood before a crowd of soldiers gathered for their final session of the day. There were no speeches, no fanfare. She didn't announce the general's visit. She didn't mention the envelope in her quarters. She simply began to teach. Breathe. Focus. Flow. Her hands moved with precision. Her eyes scanned the group. Her presence carried the weight of everything unspoken. And what the soldiers learned that night was not just how to fight, but how to be. Because Lena Park wasn't teaching combat. She was teaching discipline. She was teaching restraint. She was teaching the kind of strength that didn't need to be seen to be felt. The kind that changes everything. Word of the general's visit spread quickly. Soldiers speculated. Some said he had come to test her. Others said he had come to remove her. But when they learned she had been offered a division role, whispers turned into awe. She turned it down. She stayed here. She chose us. And with that, her legend grew deeper. Because in a world where ambition was currency, Lena Park had chosen something else entirely. She had chosen duty. But that choice carried weight. At night, when the barracks were quiet and the base had settled into sleep, Lena sat alone in her quarters. The envelope lay unopened on her desk, the general's seal unbroken. She could feel its presence like a pulse in the room, a door waiting to be opened, a path waiting to be taken. She closed her eyes, breathing steady, letting the weight pass through her. Because history wasn't written in envelopes. It was written in silence. The soldiers didn't know about her doubts. They didn't see the tiredness in her eyes, To them she was untouchable, a standard, a force. But Lena Park was still human. And every time she stepped onto the mat, she carried not just her own weight, but the weight of every soldier watching, every woman who might come after her, every silence mistaken for weakness. That was the true burden. And she carried it without complaint. Fort was no longer the same place. The base that once thrived on pride now thrived on discipline. The yard that once echoed with barked orders now breathed with synchronized silence. Soldiers no longer whispered doubts about Lena Park. They whispered her lessons. Growth starts when pride ends. Read intention, not motion. Strength isn't loud. Her words spread like doctrine. Her presence became law. And slowly, even the skeptics, men like Withers, began to understand. What Lena Park had built wasn't just stronger soldiers. She had built something deeper. She had built a standard. And yet in the quiet moments, Lena knew one truth remained. The colonel had been removed, but pride never disappears completely. It lingers, festers, waits for an opening. And somewhere in the shadows of command, there were still those who saw her silence not as strength, but as threat. She knew they would test her again. But she also knew something else. They would fail. Because silence does not break. It bends, it waits. And then, when the moment comes, it acts. Why did soldiers who once lived for noise now crave silence? At Fort, mornings had changed. The air no longer trembled with shouted commands. It pulsed with rhythm, measured breaths, synchronized movements, quiet focus. What began as a few dozen recruits on Lena Park's mat had become an entire base shifting in unison. Before dawn, they lined up silently. They moved as one. They exhaled as one. And when the sun rose, Fort glowed with something no inspection report could fully capture: discipline without arrogance, strength without noise. It was transformation. And it was undeniable. Captain Withers, once the embodiment of resistance, now arrived before most of the recruits. His presence at the edge of the mat drew whispers at first, but when he bowed slightly before stepping in, the whispers ended. He had changed. No longer the man who had crossed his arms in suspicion, he now watched Lena with careful respect. He practiced quietly among the younger soldiers, absorbing lessons he once mocked. When recruits asked for guidance, he didn't bark. He repeated Lena's words. Don't fight motion, read intention. Breathe with control, not with rage. And perhaps most shocking of all, when he lost during sparring, he accepted it. No excuses, no outbursts, just humility. The ripple of that humility spread faster than any demonstration. If Captain Withers could bow his head, then anyone could. The recruits felt it most deeply. Private, who once laughed at Lena during her first weeks on base, now trained obsessively with her breathing drills. He no longer flailed during sparring. He anticipated. He moved with purpose. Sergeant Graves, the bulldozer of a man, no longer threw his weight blindly. He used precision, striking with restraint instead of fury. Even, who had always respected her, admitted one evening that her methods had sharpened him too. "You've made us all quieter," he told her during a late-night walk across the grounds. "Quieter?" she asked. "In the head," he explained. "Less noise, less chaos, more focus." Lena smiled faintly at that, though her eyes carried their usual heaviness. Because she knew something the others didn't. The silence she carried wasn't just discipline, it was burden. Her past, though sealed in thick files and classified lines, lingered like a shadow. She had been part of the Sentinel group. She had seen things the soldiers of could never imagine. She had carried weight heavier than most men could bear. And though she never spoke of it, traces of that weight haunted her every movement. At night, when the barracks fell quiet, she sat alone in her quarters. She thought of missions gone unspoken, names never written in reports, lives lost in silence. The strength they now admired in her was built on foundations of sacrifice. She didn't want them to idolize her. She wanted them to understand her lesson. That true strength was not about the fight. It was about the restraint that came after. But whispers of idolization spread nonetheless. They say she turned down division headquarters. They say the general himself offered. They say she wanted to stay with us instead. And each whisper built her legend higher. Lena Park had become something rare at Fort, a myth still alive, walking among them. And while most embraced it, a few did not. One evening, in the officers' quarters, Captain Withers overheard a conversation that reminded him of the old. "She's softening them," a lieutenant muttered. "With respect, sir," another replied, "they're sharper than ever." Sharp, no, discipline maybe, but war doesn't need whispers, war needs teeth, and she's dulling them. Withers said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He remembered what discipline without humility had done to him. He remembered the arrogance that blinded him, and he remembered the look in Lena's eyes when she whispered, "You're off balance." For the first time in years, he defended someone other than himself. "You're wrong," he said firmly. "She's giving them something you never had, control." The room went quiet, no one argued. But the resistance lingered like smoke. Days turned into weeks. Fort thrived. Reports from higher command continued to highlight the base's transformation. Lena's methods were unofficially studied by instructors at other camps. Her words, short, simple, deliberate, appeared on whiteboards in mess halls, in notebooks carried by recruits, even etched into training mats. "Growth starts when pride ends." The phrase became a motto. But as her influence spread, so did the scrutiny. One evening stepped into her quarters with a file in hand. He set it on her desk, his eyes uneasy. "They're looking deeper now," he said. "Your past, your service record, Sentinel Group." Lena's expression didn't change. She simply closed the file without reading it. "They'll only find what I allowed them to find," she said quietly. Studied her unsettled, "And what if they want more?" Her voice lowered. "Then they'll test me, the same way Withers did." She looked up at him then, her eyes unflinching. "And the same way they'll learn. But not all tests come from above. Sometimes they rise from below." Late one night, as she walked across the dimly lit training yard, she noticed 3 recruits waiting at the far edge. Their shoulders were stiff, their movements uneasy. They weren't there to train. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice strained. We don't understand. We're supposed to fight, to dominate. That's what war is. But you." His voice cracked, his fists trembled. Lena stepped closer, her presence steady, her eyes soft. "You think restraint makes you weak?" she asked. The recruit swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." Lena stood in silence for a long moment, then finally raised her hand. Slowly, she placed it on his chest, above his racing heart. "Strength isn't about what you can destroy," she whispered. "It's about what you choose not to." The recruit's eyes filled. He lowered his head, ashamed. And in that moment, something shifted in him too. Because sometimes a broken belief weighs more than a broken bone. By the end of that month, even skeptics began to bend. The mat no longer echoed with forced sparring. It hummed with precision. The base no longer thrived on fear. It thrived on respect. And watching it all unfold, said something he had never said before. "You've built something here, Lena, something bigger than this base, something that will outlast you." She didn't answer. She only looked out at the horizon, her breath steady, her silence carrying the weight of truth. Because deep down she knew he was right. But she also knew something else. Legends don't live forever. They're always tested. And somewhere beyond Fort's gates, pride was waiting to return. Why do the hardest tests come when you least expect them? Fort had found its rhythm, its silence, its strength. But discipline is not measured on calm days. It is measured when storms return. And storms always return. It began quietly, an unmarked car arriving at the gates one gray morning. The man who stepped out wore no uniform. His suit was pressed, his expression unreadable. He carried a slim folder under his arm and an authority that outranked the base commander. Word spread quickly, intelligence division. The kind of visitor who didn't come for drills or inspections, the kind who came for people. By midday, Lena was summoned. The room was windowless, its walls bare. A single chair waited at the center. The man with the folder gestured. "Sit." She obeyed without hesitation. For several minutes, silence filled the room. He flipped through pages, glanced at her, flipped again. The weight of classified lines pressed between them. Finally, he spoke. "Lena Park, former Sentinel Group operative. Multiple deployments, black site missions, records sealed under Directive 9. Her face didn't change. "You think you can walk onto a base like this," he continued, "train soldiers your way and not raise questions. Command wants to know if your methods belong here, or if they're a liability." The word hung heavy, liability. Lena met his gaze calmly. "What do you think?" The man leaned forward. "I think you're dangerous." The room stilled. Her voice softened. "Dangerous to who?" Later that night, soldiers gathered in hushed circles. Rumors spread like wildfire. The intelligence officer had questioned her. Some said she would be removed. Some said her record would bury her. Sat with Withers in the mess hall, his voice low. "They don't understand. She's given these men something no manual could." Withers nodded slowly. "But men like that don't see growth. They see control slipping through their fingers." The room went quiet, because everyone knew what was at stake. The next morning, Lena returned to the mat as though nothing had changed. Soldiers stood waiting, their eyes searching hers for answers she didn't give. She simply bowed, breathed, and began. But her silence carried a heavier weight that day. Each movement seemed sharper, each pause more deliberate. The soldiers mirrored her with unusual intensity, as if afraid it might be their last session under her. When they finished, she looked at them, not with farewell, not with fear, but with something steadier. "Discipline," she said softly, "isn't about what happens when people are watching. It's about what you choose when they are." Her words lingered like a shield. That evening, the intelligence officer requested a demonstration, not sparring, not drills. A scenario. The entire base gathered. Floodlights illuminated the yard. Soldiers lined the edges, whispering nervously. The test was simple: multiple assailants against Lena Park. Controlled, supervised, but full contact. It wasn't fair. It wasn't meant to be. 4 men stepped forward, their orders clear: push her, expose her, break her calm. The officer stood at the edge, watching, arms folded. "Begin." The first lunged. She pivoted, redirected, sent him sprawling without a strike. The second swung wide. She slipped beneath, guided his momentum, and released him safely to the ground. The third was sharper, feints and precision strikes. She deflected, never countering with violence. But the fourth was different. He charged with raw aggression, ignoring restraint, aiming not for control but to hurt. For a moment the crowd tensed. Would she break? Would she unleash the strength they all whispered about? She didn't. Instead, she absorbed his force, twisted with measured precision, and held him immobilized without harm. 4 men neutralized, no violence, no pride. Only restraint. The yard erupted, not in cheers, not in noise, but in stunned silence, because what they had witnessed was something deeper than victory. It was proof. The officer approached slowly, his face unreadable. "You could have broken every one of them," he said. "I didn't need to," Lena replied. He studied her for a long moment. Then he closed the folder under his arm. "Perhaps you're not dangerous," he said quietly. "Perhaps you're necessary." And without another word, he left the yard. The soldiers swarmed her after, not with questions but with quiet respect, clapped her shoulder once, withers bowed slightly, recruits stood in her presence. And Lena, as always, said nothing. Because she didn't need to. Weeks passed. The officer never returned. The envelope from division headquarters remained unopened in her quarters. Fort thrived, sharper than ever. Soldiers carried her words like banners, her lessons like scripture. But Lena Park remained the same, calm, quiet, steady. And though whispers of her legend spread far beyond, she never chased them. Because she knew the truth. Legends don't speak for themselves. They're carried by the ones who believe. On her last evening before rotation, she stood alone in the training yard. The mat was empty, the air still. She knelt slowly, pressing her palm against the surface where countless feet had stood, countless breaths had aligned, countless lessons had taken root. Her eyes closed. Her silence held. And somewhere deep within, she whispered to herself a truth she had always known. Strength is not the breaking of bones. It is the breaking of pride. Strength is not the noise of dominance. It is the silence of restraint. And dignity, true dignity, doesn't speak. It simply acts.